For the first time in its history, the UFC had to cancel an entire event. It wasn't because of a problem with the venue or a broadcast failure. It was because one man, the most dominant champion on the roster, said two simple words: "I refuse." That decision didn't just scrap a pay-per-view. It set off a firestorm, cost fighters their paychecks, and unleashed the full, unfiltered fury of Dana White. It created a rift that has defined their relationship for over a decade. To really get why this was such an explosion, you have to understand the two people at the center of it. By August 2012, Jon "Bones" Jones wasn't just a champion, he was a full-blown phenomenon. At only 25, he was the youngest title holder in UFC history, a light heavyweight who seemed absolutely invincible and had run through a list of legends. He was creative, unpredictable, and looked like he was on his way to becoming the greatest of all time. He was the UFC's golden goose, the guy who showed where the sport was headed. On the other side, you had Dana White, the loud, no-nonsense president of the UFC. White built the company from a fringe spectacle into a global sports giant through pure force of will. His philosophy was simple: the show must go on, fighters fight. When you get the call, you answer. This was a rule forged in the chaotic early days of the sport, and for him it was non-negotiable. These two titans, the fighter and the promoter, were on a collision course. Their relationship was professional, sure, but it was all based on a delicate power balance between a star athlete and the massive organization he fought for. The stage was set for UFC 151 on September 1st, 2012. Jones was supposed to defend his title against a tough veteran, Dan Henderson. It was a big fight, a classic matchup for a major pay-per-view. Everything was running smoothly. And then, with just 8 days left, the whole thing fell apart. The news hit like a lightning bolt. Dan Henderson had torn his MCL in training and was out. Losing a main event is a crisis for any fight card. For a pay-per-view just a week away, it's a full-blown catastrophe. The UFC scrambled, and Dana White did what he always does: he found a fix. The fix was named Chael Sonnen. Sonnen, the American gangster, was one of the biggest trash talkers and biggest draws in the sport. He was fresh off a massive rivalry with Anderson Silva, and more importantly, he was ready to step in on short notice. Sonnen jumped at the chance, seeing a golden opportunity to cut the line and fight for the title. From the UFC's point of view, crisis averted. They had a new main event, a story they could sell, and a guy who would promote the hell out of the fight. All they needed was the champ to say yes. But Jon Jones and his team at Jackson Wink MMA saw things very differently. Greg Jackson, Jones's head coach, was a master strategist known for his detailed game plans. When the offer came in, his advice to Jones was blunt: taking a fight against a totally different style of opponent, a wrestler like Sonnen, on just 8 days' notice, would be the biggest mistake of his entire career. Jackson later argued it was really only 3 days' notice, since the final week is all media and weight cutting, not real training. It was a huge risk. A loss would be devastating, wrecking his perfect record and costing him the belt. A win would just be what everyone expected. Jones listened to his coach. He weighed his options: protect his legacy and his title, or save the show for the company. He made his choice. He said no. The fallout was instant and explosive. When Dana White heard his champion had refused the replacement, he went ballistic. This had never happened before. Champions just didn't do this. In White's world, you fight who they tell you to fight. Jones's refusal wasn't just a scheduling problem, it was a mutiny. With no main event and no time to find one, the UFC did the unthinkable. They canceled UFC 151. It was the first time in the company's history. The financial hit was massive. The company lost a ton of money, but even worse, the fighters on the undercard, the men and women who relied on that fight to pay their bills, were left with nothing. They had trained for months, spent money on fight camps, and now they wouldn't get a paycheck. Dana White held an emergency press conference, and what came next was one of the most savage public bashings in sports history. He didn't hold back. He called Jones's decision selfish and disgusting. He blamed the champ for everything, saying he'd let down the company, the fans, and his fellow fighters. But White saved his sharpest attacks for Greg Jackson. He called the famous coach a sport killer, accusing him of being the evil mastermind behind the whole thing. White declared it one of my all-time lows. The message was loud and clear. Jon Jones and his camp were now public enemy number one. The MMA world was split right down the middle. Some fans and experts backed Jones, saying that as the champion, he had every right to protect his career from a ridiculously risky last-minute fight. They also pointed out that the UFC was partly to blame for building a card so weak it couldn't handle losing one fight. Others sided with Dana, calling Jones selfish for hurting other fighters' wallets. Jones stood by his choice. He later said it was about respecting the preparation needed to compete at that level. He even got a little suspicious, noting how close his original opponent Dan Henderson was with Chael Sonnen and wondered if he was being set up. In a recent podcast, Jones reflected on it, saying Dana just didn't see the logic in it. He admitted their relationship was almost broken beyond repair. UFC 151 was wiped from the history books, a ghost event that never happened. Jones returned a few weeks later at UFC 152 against Vitor Belfort. And ironically, he did end up fighting and destroying Chael Sonnen at UFC 159, winning by a first-round TKO. But the damage to his relationship with Dana White was done. That single no in 2012 created a crack of tension and mistrust that has run through Jones's entire career. It's popped up in contract fights, arguments over opponents, and his long breaks from the sport. It set the stage for a constant battle between Jones, the brilliant but controversial star, and White, the powerful, demanding promoter. The UFC 151 mess is still one of the most debated moments in the sport. Was Jon Jones right to protect his legacy? Or was Dana White right to be furious, looking out for the company and the other fighters on the card? Let us know who you think was right down in the comments. Now, more than a decade later, you can still feel the tremors from UFC 151. Jon Jones is the UFC heavyweight champion, having pretty much cemented his case as the greatest of all time. But his relationship with Dana White and the UFC is as complicated as ever. The old drama has found new life in the heavyweight division. After winning the belt, Jones was set to fight Stipe Miocic, but an injury took him out. In his place, Tom Aspinall won an interim title, becoming the obvious next guy in line. But Jones hasn't seemed interested in fighting Aspinall, instead calling for other fights or a huge payday. This has created a standoff that feels a lot like 2012 all over again. Fans are getting annoyed, other fighters are calling for Jones to be stripped, and Dana White is once again in a public power struggle with his champion. White recently said that if the Aspinall fight isn't made soon, the UFC will move on quickly. But he's also confident it will happen in 2025. The fight over UFC 151 wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was a clash of worlds between a fighter laser-focused on his own career and a promoter obsessed with the show. That basic conflict still defines their relationship, proving that the day Jon Jones pissed off Dana White wasn't just a moment. It was the start of a feud that has shaped the modern UFC. Fast forward to June 2025, and that same friction is dominating heavyweight headlines. On June 17, Dana White told Jim Rome that the promotion would move on quickly if a Jones-Aspinall unifier isn't inked within 2 weeks, framing the ultimatum as a final test of Jones's commitment. The very next day, White doubled down during a scrum, setting a hard deadline and hinting the belt could be reallocated if the champion keeps stalling. Jones's response only deepened the rift. He first tweeted shock at White's claim that he had already accepted the fight, saying "news to me," and accused the UFC of negotiating through the media. Hours later, he abruptly walked off the Full Send podcast when a host asked about Aspinall, muttering "see you later." A walk-off instantly turned into viral fodder and fresh ammunition for White's narrative that the champ is ducking challengers. Fans launched an online petition urging the UFC to strip Jones if he refuses, while White publicly floated alternative pairings for Aspinall, signaling he is ready to repeat the hardball tactics seen after UFC 151. He has even teased matching Aspinall with former champions Cyril Gane or Alex Pereira to keep the division forward, fueling late-minute 2025 matchmaking speculation.